Welcome, friends, to Seeking the True Self. This is our last class for the series, and in this progression of techniques that can bring us to different aspects of what we can call self-knowledge, we come today to what, at least in this approach, is the highest technique. And we are going to see how this relates also to previous techniques that we have explored. So just to recap, in the first technique that we explored, the self-examination, was a first step into getting to know the personal self through which we as pure consciousness express ourselves. And this particular personality has certain qualities, characteristics, tendencies, and it is important to begin to develop a self-knowledge in the sense of knowing how the personality tends to react to different situations. In many traditions, Western traditions in philosophy or in psychology, when we talk about self-knowledge, generally speaking, this is the scope of self-knowledge that they are ready to accept. The ability to know to some extent what we call in Theosophy the personal self. But then in the second class, we moved a little further, and through the technique of self-inquiry, we tried to find the essence of what I call myself. And we searched for the essence, for that I-ness, that permanent I-ness. We searched for it in the physical, in our physical aspect, then in the emotional aspect, then in our mental dimension with the memory, etc. And we couldn't find any permanent element there that could be the basis for our sense of being always ourselves, being the same person in spite of the constant changes of our bodies, emotions, thoughts, minds, memories. But at least we get to, through that technique, we get to a point of silence in which there is no thought, no emotions, no sensations. Or if there are, we place ourselves beyond the reach of them. Not that we don't feel them, but we can remain immutable, untouched, even though there may be thoughts, emotions, and sensations. Of course, to reach that point of silence, we require a certain work. It's not that just by doing it once or a few times we can get there. But by means of that technique, we start touching that silence. And today we are going to continue from this technique into how to dwell in that silence. But before that, in the following class, what we did is, once we reached that silence, then we look down as if it were, in a kind of diagram. We raise our consciousness, and from the point of silence that is beyond body, emotions, and thoughts, we look down, we witness the activity of our thoughts, our emotions, our sensations from this point of view of a silent awareness. So that's what we have done so far. Now in this fourth technique, what we are going to do is to dwell in the silence, but instead of witnessing the personal self, we will try to look up, so to say, to whatever is beyond the silence and the darkness in which that we can reach by means of these techniques. So that will be the idea for today. I call this self-dwelling, in the sense of dwelling on the sense of being, on the sense of I am. And to begin, let us see something that Annie Besant said. She says, the one certainty for each of us, needing no proof, beyond all argument, incapable of being strengthened by any act of the reason, is the sure truth I am. This is the ultimate fact of consciousness, the foundation on which everything else is built. All is inference, save the one central fact of consciousness, that is, that I am. All else changes, but that never. So this is something that French philosopher Descartes engaged in. He said, what is that thing which can be undeniable? Because everything can be doubted. For example, we may doubt that this is happening right now. For all we know, this could be a dream. When we are in a dream, in complex situations, we don't realize most of the times that that is a dream. And we firmly believe in that reality. So anything we perceive could be a dream. Things that seem to be solid in front of us may just be a creation of our minds. So you can deny everything, the existence of the world, the sun, everything as being just part of a kind of virtual reality that is being put in our minds. For example, there is this idea in philosophy that if science was developed enough, theoretically we could have a brain in a jar with electrodes and cables connected to the brain, sending electric impulses, just like the senses do, sent to the brain, and make a world appear in that brain, and that brain would think that it is whatever entity we are sending information about, and that the brain is in that world. That is a kind of virtual reality. So in philosophy, they say, how do we know that this is not the case? That we are not no more than a brain in a jar in the future. So anyway, the idea is that everything can be doubted except one thing, which is what Descartes came to. He said, the fact that I am thinking means that I am. I think, therefore I am, he said. And I cannot deny the fact that I am. I can't deny everything else. Everything I think of may be wrong, but the fact that I'm thinking means that I am. Of course, from a spiritual point of view, we can move a little further. Thinking is not a proof that I am, because therefore it means that if there is no thinking, then there is no being. So what we have seen in the previous techniques, as we have seen, we can find through practice, we can find ourselves being in perfect and complete silence, where there is only awareness. It can be an awareness of no external object, and yet we still exist. So in any case, what Annie Besant is saying here is that after all, there is only one fact that is undeniable, and that fact is the fact that we are. All else, as she says, is inference. All else is changing except for this fact that I am, and that is unchanging. So then she says, in that stability, that changelessness is the mark of the real. The real is the changeless, the eternal. And this one changeless thing is the real, engarbed in form. So she says that the sense of I am, the sense of I amness in us, is the mark of the real within our form, in the sense of within this fragment of reality that each one of us are, this fragment of reality which is limited, within this, the mark of the real is this sense of I amness. Within our field of perception, this sense of I amness is the eternal, is the changeless. All else that we perceive, memory, thoughts, feelings, sensations, they all come and go. All ideas, I am this, I am that, being thoughts, they just come and go. But the sense of being, the sense of existing, that is a permanent sense, she says. And in this, most spiritual teachers agree. So let's see how we can actually perceive and then dwell on this sense of I-ness, which is the mark of the self, in the mark of the eternal, in the impermanent that is our personality. So let's take something that Geoffrey Hodgson, the theosophist that lived most of his life in New Zealand, what he proposed. He proposed an approach in connection to the idea of unity, which in the theosophical view, unity and the self are one, because there is only one self, and that one universal self is the unity behind everything. So he said, you can think your way up to the threshold of unity, but you cannot cross it by thought alone. To get behind consciousness with consciousness is impossible. You need a higher organ, another instrument of consciousness. So far we have been using thinking, either to examine the personality or to do this meditative inquiry, trying to search for the essence of what we are. In those two approaches, we have been using thinking. In the third approach, in our previous class, we let go of thinking as a means to try to find out anything. We just witness in silence whatever is there. But now we have a different challenge. Now we are trying to discover the essence of what we are. And in doing so, we cannot use thought, because thinking, or feeling for that matter, belongs to the kind of consciousness that we already looked into, and we saw that the essence of self is not there. So if we are going to touch the essence of the self, which is beyond thinking, obviously thinking cannot be used for that. Thinking has to be left behind. So in modern philosophy and psychology, they say there is nothing else. There is nothing more than thinking and feeling and all that you can find in the psyche. Therefore, if there is any universal self, the search for the self is impossible. If there is anything, it is just beyond our reach. The theosophical teachings don't agree with that and postulate that there is indeed a higher faculty than thinking, which is latent in most people because we are never taught how to access it. Most people don't believe in its existence, and at this point in evolution, it's not that easy to get there. But because this is part of what we are, it is available. It just requires some work, as anything else in our life, for that matter. Anything we want to accomplish requires a certain amount of work. So Hodgson is saying here that another instrument of consciousness is necessary, what in theosophy we call buddhi, from the Sanskrit word, and that is the source of an intuitive, direct perception as opposed to thinking or feeling. And let's see what else he says. Now, how are we going to get there? He says, before the center of awareness and observation in a person can reach this condition, where unity is obvious, and see the uniting principle behind all the diversity, 3 mental procedures are necessary. So he says, basically he's saying we can use thought up to a certain point. Thought is a means, it's an instrument for this, but at some point we have to leave thought behind. So let's see what we can do by means of our thought, our will, and let's use it in that way, and then let's see how we jump beyond. So he says there are 3 procedures that we can go through. The first one, he says, think your way towards the principle of oneness as far as you possibly can. So the first step is not just to give up any mental endeavor, because we recognize that this is beyond the mind. We are not going to reach it merely by denying the mind, by giving up on that aspect of our being. On the contrary, we have to go through the mind, so to say, and go beyond, not go back to the pre-mind. We have to go through, as we said in our previous class, to transcend the mind. So the first step is to use our mind in the best possible way, so that the mind can take us as far as the mind can. In an example that is sometimes used in Buddhism, in this case, the mind would be like a boat that we are using to cross to the other shore. The other shore is the land that is beyond thoughts. But to get there, we need a boat that belongs to the land of thought. So we can use that boat to get to the other shore. Now, once we get to the other shore, we have to abandon the boat. We have to leave it behind. We have to make a leap into the shore, out of the boat, and leave the boat behind. We cannot carry the boat while we walk on that land. So this is what we are going to do. We are going to use our reason to take us to the other shore, and then we need to drop it, to leave it behind. So let's see how we can do this first step. This is something that Annie Besant explains. In searching for the Atman, for the universal self, the true self, she says, plane of Atman, or the quality of this universal self, the region of being, where all is reality, where true consciousness resides. This is what the plane of Atman is. We are to seek this way by study of our inmost being. So this is an inner study. This is an inner journey. And she says, we begin to search for it by trying to realize its existence. Think of it as in a region where all is reality, where all limitations have vanished, where unity is recognized. So the first step, she says, we begin to search for it, trying to realize the existence of something like this. So there is here some kind of meditation. For example, reading about the higher consciousness, about Buddhi, about Atman, reading about unity is a first step to familiarize ourselves with the concepts, to start getting our mind familiar with ideas that are really beyond what we perceive in our daily life. And then by dwelling on this, studying about this, meditating on the concepts, the mind begins to attune itself to that kind of reality. So we can, take any different theosophical literature where the higher consciousness is explained and use it for meditation. Then Besant says, once we are familiar with that, in meditation, she says, try to imagine this universal self, try to figure it to yourself. And then she says, you can only do so by a series of negatives. You seek it by eliminating what it is not. Because the problem is that all our thinking is based on what we can call the not self. What we can say is diversity. We see everything separate. Everything we see, everything we know, everything we can think of is separate, is impermanent, is relative. So how can we think of something that is not any of that? It's like saying, imagine how an alien from outer space may be. We will only be able to imagine it in terms of what we already know. Maybe it's not going to have 2 feet, it may have 8, but it has feet. Or maybe the feet are not like ours. Maybe they are in some other way, but they will resemble, I don't know, what the worms have. Or you see, when we cannot think of something that is unknown to us. So when seeking for the real, because the mind cannot really picture it, the safest way is to realize what it is not and to let it go. And this is the technique by which, using our mind, we will come to a place in which the mind, as we are going to see, stays quiet, receptive to a higher perception to come to the mind. Because whatever the mind imagines is a projection from the known. It's a projection from what is in the mind. That's why we imagine God as being in heaven, sitting on a throne with a beard, being our Father. These are all human elements that we know. So Annie Besant says, you seek it, the real, the self, by eliminating what it is not. You then say, it is not a thing that the senses can perceive. And stop there. Try to grasp, okay, so the self is not something that the senses perceive. So anything that you may have an idea of, which idea that came through your senses, the self is nothing like that. So in your search, you kind of let go of all that aspect. You let go of expecting the self to be a vision, a sensation, a feeling, an idea. Then Besant says it is not what the intelligence can imagine, because of what we just said, that anything the mind can imagine is, ultimately speaking, using elements that are known. It is not found even in the illuminated intelligence with its vast extent and so on. So it's a process of letting go of everything that we know. We will see some other examples, but I want to see the principle right now. This kind of meditation is not a mechanical meditation that we can just repeat. These are investigations in consciousness. These are journeys in which there is nothing predetermined, there is nothing mechanical, there is nothing that we know. This is facing the unknown. All the technique can give us in this kind of meditation is a general guide, which is saying, try to search for this, and you can search it in this way, but we have to do the search. So if we just sit down and repeat, it is not a thing that the senses can perceive, it is not what the intelligence can imagine, the mere repetition of that is not going to produce much. We have to try to realize what the implications of this are. Meditate on this. Okay, the self is not something that the senses can perceive. So it's not this, it's not that, it's nothing that belongs to. Try to see, what do I think is the self? Give an answer and see if that idea falls within what the senses can perceive or within the imagination of your mind. And when you realize that, say, okay, this cannot be the self. The self is the soul. What is that? The soul is just an idea that you got from books. No, but the self is this feeling. Well, what is the feeling? The feeling is, again, something that falls within the realm of the senses. So you see, you have to go through this investigation, which you may do it every day for months, And little by little, you get clearer and clearer about what the self is not. So that is the first step that Jeffrey Hudson was saying. Think your way towards the principle of oneness as far as you possibly can. And then he says, then, once you have discarded everything that you can think of, you are left with nothing. So he says, then still the mind so that it does not interfere. At some point say, okay, I did everything I could with my thoughts, and this is obviously beyond anything I can imagine. So I'll just keep quiet. Not because you decide to keep quiet, but because you realize, I cannot find the self with this. So there are only two options. Either you receive and you say, if the self exists, it is unreachable, which, as I said, is what modern philosophy and psychology normally say, or you can stay there. You say, there is nothing my mind can do, but let's see what happens if I stay there. So Hudson says, then still the mind so that it does not interfere. And he quotes two phrases, one from the Psalms, be still and know that I am God, with the implication that it's only in the stillness that we can know the divine. Or something that Emerson said, let us be silent that we may hear the whisper of the gods. So silence has always been a key element in all mysticism from East and West. By this means, we get to the silence, which this is similar to what we have done with the inquiry. You know, we were searching for this permanent element. It was not in the body and sensations. We left that behind, and we examine everything that we can perceive is ourselves, and seeing that it's nowhere there, we stay in silence. And now we are going to see what do we do when we stay in silence. So this is more or less what we discussed in the second class, but now applied to the universal self, let's say. Now, regarding the silence, here there is a quote from Mahatma Kutumi, who was one of Blavatsky's teachers. He says, it is upon the serene and placid surface of the unruffled mind that the visions gathered from the invisible find a representation in the visible world. So the visions from the invisible can appear in the realm of the visible world of which we are aware only upon the serene and placid surface of the unruffled mind. So it's like, suppose we can never look up. So how can we know the moon? Well, we can know the moon if we find a very still pond at night, and we can see the reflection of the moon on that still pond. If the pond is not perfectly still, we will see the moon distorted. So it is only upon this still mind that a reflection from the real can come, and we can perceive the reflection of the real in the mind. This, by the way, is essentially the principle that Patanjali, the father of the discipline of yoga, not yoga simply as a series of physical exercises, but the yoga as a spiritual path. This is how Patanjali says there can be any self-knowledge, because the self, being the subject of perception, can never become the object of perception. It's not that we can see our own self, because that means we, the one that is seeing, is separate from the self, the one that is seen. So obviously we can never see our own self. It's like the eye trying to see itself. But Patanjali says self-knowledge is possible because the self, which is the ultimate seer, can see its own reflection in the perfectly still mind. So this is basically what we are coming to here. We can we are always the self. We can only be the self, not know the self, as I said, as if it was something different from us. But seeing the reflection of the self undistorted in the mirror of the mind is the preliminary step for the self-realization. Because the one problem that doesn't allow us to realize what we really are is that we are confused. We always think that we are something we are not. So the preliminary step, the step that is just before the self-realization, is the ability to see our true image in a perfectly still mind. And this is what all these quotes are talking about. Now, we cannot keep a perfectly still mind in meditation if our mind is constantly restless during our lives. This is something that we can see. We all have the experience of sitting down, trying to meditate, and realizing how restless our minds are. So if we are going to be able to do this in meditation, part of our training has to be done in daily life. In daily life, we have to learn how to go through the experiences with a quieter mind. So the same Mahatma said, it is with jealous care that we have to guard our mind plane, the mind aspect in ourselves, from all the adverse influences which daily arise in our passage through earth life. And he also said in another occasion, the disciple's prime and constant qualification is a calm, even contemplative state of mind. The mind can be made to work with electric swiftness in a high excitement, but the buddhi, this higher perception that we were talking about, never. To its clear region, calm must ever reign. So part of our work is to learn how to gradually, progressively go through life with a calmer mind. For this, many things are necessary. A better understanding of life, so that what happens in life is not producing constantly frustration, fear, sense of injustice or unfairness. Because we don't perceive life properly, we react to life because we don't understand it. The more we understand life, the less we react to life. So studying serious literature to understand what life is about so that our mind stops constantly reacting to it is an important part of the spiritual path, not only meditation. And then trying to live little by little from the point of view of what our studies are, the realizations that our studies are bringing is also an important part. And then also beginning to work in meditation, trying to explore deeper into ourselves. So the quiet mind is a very important aspect of the spiritual life. And of course, we cannot expect from one day to the other being able to go to life and just face everything with equanimity. There is a lot of work to be done, and the equanimity is something that will come not by us trying to repress reactions or trying to escape from the world. The equanimity is a byproduct of developing wisdom. Anyway, that is not the main object in this particular class. So this is what so far Hudson is saying. First, think your way towards the principle of oneness, or towards trying to perceive or to understand or to touch what the true self is. Then still the mind. And finally, he says, focus the center of awareness above the mind. Before, in the previous technique, we came to the point of silence and we looked down at the activity of thoughts, emotions, sensations. Now we come to the point of silence, but we are trying to look beyond the mind, to keep looking up, in this diagram. So above the division into unity. affirming unity with God or the divine, and becoming mentally still. So the third stage is one of trying to look through the quiet mind. He says at the beginning, this is not easy to do in any real way. So do the last two steps in imagination at the beginning, until by practice, it becomes possible to transfer the center of consciousness from the form, the level of forms in which we live, to the formless level. From the phenomenal, the phenomena means appearances, from the appearances that our senses bring, to the noumenal universe. Noumenal is the causes that are behind the appearances, from effects to causes. So basically, he suggests that if we cannot be in silence, and in darkness, in silence, the divine darkness that Pseudo-Dionysius, the very important Christian mystic, used to talk about, if we cannot dwell in this darkness and silence, maybe we can imagine it at the beginning, because we don't know how to stay without using our minds. Well, you use your mind in a way that will take you there. So at the beginning, maybe we can just imagine that we are just quiet in silence and darkness. And then little by little, you can move beyond that and actually be in quietness with no use of imagination. So let's see a little about this third step. Blavatsky said something similar. She said, the student who is not naturally psychic should fix the fourfold consciousness, fourfold in the sense the personal consciousness, meaning the body with its vitality, the emotions, and the mind. So fix the fourfold consciousness on a higher plane and nail it there. Let him make a bundle of the four lower and pin them to a higher state. He should center on this higher, trying not to permit the body and intellect to draw him down and carry him away. So Blavatsky, many times Blavatsky's methods were based mainly on, let's call it willpower. You just do it. Fix your sight in the formless and stay there. Some people work in that way, and some other people need a little more of a technique. Hudson proposes more of a technique. Blavatsky is basically saying just nail your consciousness in the silence and darkness, leave behind thoughts, sensations, emotions, your body, your vitality, and stay there. Don't let the body or your mind bring you down there. Then Annie Besant talks about this a little more. She says, he who would deliberately quicken his own evolution will gaze into the darkness beyond the intellect, seeking by concentrated meditation to find the light that is beyond the darkness, the light of the real, of the self. So she's saying, first with your meditation, realize that the self is beyond any image. And then fix your attention in that silence, in that darkness, beyond which is the self. So it's like you are trying to pierce through the darkness, the silence. She says, in that silence, if you remain aware within the silence, within the darkness, without allowing any images to come, in that silence will arise within the spiritual consciousness, responding to subtle thrillings from an unknown world, first feebly and then more strongly. With a courage ever increasing, that loftier consciousness answers to the without and realizes the within. He knows himself as spirit, he knows himself as divine. So this is similar to, for example, what in the Cloud of Unknowing, another Christian mystic text, the author, whom we don't know who he is, but the the consensus is that he was heavily influenced by Dionysius, the one that I mentioned. Dionysius was supposed to be a disciple of St. Paul, Dionysius the Areopagite. And for many centuries, the author of these mystic works was supposed to be the disciple of St. Paul. Now scholars say this person could not have been the disciple of St. Paul because the writings seem to be more modern, so they call him Pseudo-Dionysius. In any case, the Cloud of Unknowing, we don't know who wrote it, but he's heavily influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius. And he would say that, leave behind everything in a cloud of forgetting, all images of, even if it is of God, all praise to God, all, thinking about God's goodness, all that is a preliminary step. Leave all that behind in a cloud of forgetting, forget about that, and plant yourself in a cloud of unknowing, where there is no knowing, where there is nothing to be perceived, where you are just there in utter silence and darkness, and the only thing that is there is your love for the divine. In Christianity, love is an important, in Christian mysticism, it's a very important tool. It can be love, it can be a very purified, impersonal will, it can be just earnestness, there are different things that can lead us there. But basically, the idea is to stay gazing into the silence and the darkness, and eventually the divine will, or the reflection of the divine will, come into the quiet mind. Now, in Theosophical literature, this is interpreted as raising your consciousness to a higher plane, to a more spiritual state. And Besant says the passing to a higher condition of consciousness is always preceded by what seems like an extinction of consciousness. That is, we lose what we have. We lose all the distinctions and the differences and the limitations which are our consciousness. Those go, and we are obliged to have the courage to let the whole of those go. And we seem to be sinking into a condition of practical annihilation. Many people report that when they face silence, it is scary, that they feel they become afraid. They become afraid that they are disappearing, or that they are leaving and they don't know if they can come back, or something like that. And that fear is normally the fear of the personal ego, which the personal ego is disappearing, because the personal ego is based on the mind and the emotions and the sensations. So when the consciousness that is behind the personal ego leaves and goes to this higher plane, the personal ego, which is just a phantom, disappears. But that when the consciousness is leaving the personal ego may produce a sense of fear. So part of the spiritual training is a training in detachment, in becoming willing to let go of the known, in not being attached to sensations, because as long as we are attached to sensations, that becomes a chain, a very strong chain that will not allow us to sink in this state where there is only awareness with no object of awareness. We don't perceive a sensation, we don't perceive anything. It's a state in which all perceptions are left behind. So for most people, there are several difficulties along the way. One is a difficulty of keeping the attention focused on one thing for enough time. So the practice of concentration is important to train our attention to dwell poised without struggle on some particular line of inquiry, or on some, even on the silence. The second difficulty is to train the mind to remain in silence. The mind is constantly bringing up thoughts, emotions, etc. So a second difficulty, once we are able to focus our mind, is learning to suspend thought for a few seconds at least and dwell just in the silence. And the third difficulty is to have the detachment, the equanimity by which we can leave behind everything we know and we just dissolve in the silence, dissolve in the sense that all our ideas of ourselves disappear. The only thing that is left there is a pure awareness, pure impersonal awareness. And so you see that there are stages. The whole spiritual training has a very specific purpose, has the purpose of preparing us to take this journey. And if we don't have those skills, then we can never traverse this journey. This is the reason why there are different, spiritual exercises where all serious traditions, spiritual traditions, have their sadhana, their practice to train the aspirants in this way. So in this webinar, what I'm doing is drawing the map, presenting the theory behind this, and giving some exercises for you to more or less have a taste of it. But there is much more. Then there is the actual work on this that we don't have time to go through here, but we do in some other webinars. But with all this, there is a natural progression. That progression may happen so naturally that we may not notice it, or it may happen less naturally, by a certain hard work, we may be pushing these stages, and then we are a little more aware of the different stages that we have gone through. So there are different people that work in different ways. So Annie Besant says, that is the great act of faith, to let it all go, to throw ourselves off what seems to us a rock of certainty into what seems to be the whirlpool of uncertainty that awaits us. So in a sense, it's a little death. It's a death to the past, a momentary death to the past, to the ideas of who we are, what we wish, leaving everything behind. There, Annie Besant says, is what the Christian mystics have called entering into the cloud. This is the cloud of unknowing that I was talking about. And that is what is meant in the phrase of Patanjali, the father of yoga that I mentioned, referring to this cloud. So Patanjali also talks about the cloud of virtue, which is this complete a cloud, because you when you are within a cloud, you don't see anything. So both the Christian mystics and Patanjali describe this state as a cloud in the sense that there is no perception, but it's a cloud that we can only dwell in this cloud when our consciousness has been purified from the sources of restlessness. So this is why Patanjali calls it the cloud of virtue. So Annie Besant says, to anyone who has practiced meditation so as to be able to pass on to another plane, that word, the cloud, becomes perfectly clear. It is the condition in which you are when you have lost the consciousness of one plane and have not yet gained that of the other. Everything below that has been your life and consciousness has gone. You are in a cloud. The phrase is most expressive. So that period of dark awareness of darkness is a transition from our normal mental perception into a more intuitive perception. And the transition requires this gap of awareness of nothing, because we have left behind everything that we normally are aware of, and we are waiting for the other plane to dawn into our awareness. So for a while, you are aware there of nothing. In that emptiness that you have made, in the process of meditation. In that void, whence the unreal has disappeared, from which the changing has vanished, and where for a moment you feel disappointed, in that void, there arises upon you the higher consciousness, the deathless, the unchanging, the eternal, the will of which your changing wishes are the reflection in the lower world, the wisdom of which your varying thoughts are the images in the lower world, the activity of which your changing actions are the reflections in the lower world. So it is in that emptiness that the real can come and flourish. Of course, this normally doesn't happen the first time that you do it, that you are actually able to stay in that silence. And statistically speaking, it may take even a few years dwelling in the silence. But eventually the higher, comes to the mind. So how can we practice this? And again, to be successful completely successful in the practice, we need to have our foundations built. But nevertheless, we can always try these things, because even if at the moment we cannot really touch that state, the very fact of walking that path begins to develop the ability to get there. So Wedgwood, who was an English theosophist, he said, passing through the various stages of self-inquiry, he was describing what we saw in the second class. Look at the body and the sensations, realize that you are beyond them and let the sensations go. Look at the emotions, realize you are beyond them because you can manipulate your emotions, therefore you are something else than the emotions, let that go. Look at your mind, you can manipulate your thoughts, therefore you are something that is beyond the thoughts, let that go. So passing through the various stages, the person may raise himself into the contemplation of that which is beyond words, ineffably real and sacred, reaching the very shrine of his own being, the altar upon which the divine itself is made manifest. So this is what we are going to do. First, use the technique of self-inquiry that we did in the second class. And when you get to that state of silence beyond sensations, thoughts, and emotions, just dwell in the silence. Keep your attention fixed on the darkness and silence without being dragged down to the mental, emotional, or physical levels. Now, because the silence itself has its own subtle objects of perception, at the beginning we think that there is nothing in silence, but then little by little we start realizing that that silence is full of certain things. It's not just mere negation. The first thing that we see, that we perceive in the silence, beyond thoughts, emotions, and sensations, is the sense of being present. We perceive that always, but it's always mixed up with something else. You say, I am thinking, I am doing this, I am, and that I am is always like conditioned by whatever comes later. I am, happy, I am a father. That is like that I am seems to morph into whatever comes later. And we only realize that I amness, not in its pure and naked, let's say pure naked state, but we perceive that I amness in its already colored way. So in silence, we begin to perceive this I amness in its pure way. It's just a simple sense of being. You know that you are here, that you are present. There is a feeling, I am present. What is that feeling, I am present? In meditation, look into that. How do you know you are present? Because that sense of presence is there even if there are no thoughts, no emotions, no sensations. This is part of what we start realizing in this exercise. You leave behind all these things, and at the beginning there is only silence. And then what you start realizing, that there is this background sense of being, I amness. And this is what we are going to stick to. Eventually, even the sense of I amness has to be left behind. But because I'm going sequentially here, we can't jump from entering into the silence to transcending the feeling of I amness. Normally, the way that we can transcend the feeling of I amness is first by dwelling on it. In the cloud of unknowing that I mentioned, the idea was that by letting everything go, you can let go of everything by means of your will. You choose to let go of your thoughts, emotions, etc. But there is something, he says, the mystic says, that only God can get rid of by you, or in you. You cannot get rid of that. And that is the sense of I-ness, the pure sense of I-ness. So in the Theosophical view, yes, it is the divine consciousness that gets rid of that. But that divine consciousness is what we really are. It's not an entity separate from us. But the way that this happens is by dwelling on that pure, unqualified sense of I amness. So try to perceive in the silence the simple sense of I amness. This is not the thought I am so and so that rests on memory, but an undefined and unspoken feeling, or feeling not in the sense of emotion or sensation. It's a sense of something. We don't have a word for that. Let's say a feeling of I am, I exist. Dwell on this feeling, doing nothing but paying attention to it. As you practice, the sense of I amness will become clearer and clearer. So this is what I am calling self-dwelling. Dwell on the pure sense of I amness. First, encounter the silence, and then as you stay in silence, there is something that will start dawning into consciousness. That is the pure sense of I amness. Then stick to it, and then you will realize that even that sense of I amness can be transcended, and you leave behind everything. But that will come only naturally after we have the ability to dwell in the sense of I-ness. So once you have made some effort to keep your awareness focused on the dark and silent sense of I amness, relax all effort and just be. You will see that at the beginning, that's in order to remain aware of the sense of I amness, you will have to make an effort. If you don't make any effort, you find yourself engaged again in thoughts, emotions, etc. So for a while, before something, at least in my experience, and I think that's also explained in many spiritual texts, before something becomes spontaneous, effort is necessary to get there. While the effort is being done, we are like in an intermediate state. We are not quite there, but we are not in the previous state. So the effort is like the leap outside of the boat into the other shore before we landed on the other shore. So at the beginning, normally we have to make some effort. But in time, we realize that we can just rest there, dwell there without making an effort. And then when we are able to dwell there spontaneously, that means that we landed there. Now, there are several other levels beyond that. The I amness is the highest perception within the personal self. The I amness is the touch of the divine, as Annie Besant was saying, within the personal. So we have to even transcend the sense of I amness. But as I said, that can only come after we have the ability to dwell in pure I amness. And again, the same process is repeated. We have to make some effort to go beyond that until going beyond the sense of I amness in a state of completely objectless awareness until that becomes spontaneous. But as I said, there is no reason to talk too much about that. First, we have quite a bit of work to do by trying to learn how to dwell in the self.